The man ran barefoot into the warm Milwaukee night, blood streaking down his face, panic breaking through every step. He burst from an apartment building on North 25th Street and flagged down a police car with wild eyes and shaking hands. His voice cracked as he tried to explain. He had escaped from someone who wouldn't let him leave. The officers looked him over. He was disoriented, slurring, barely able to stand. Another man stepped calmly out of the building behind him, glasses neat, voice steady. He told the officers it was a misunderstanding. A lover's argument. Too much alcohol. Nothing more. The officers hesitated. The calm man smiled. And with that smile, the moment slipped away. That night would become one of the most infamous failures in modern American policing. But in that moment, under the streetlights, it was just another call, another problem that could be solved quickly if everyone went home. The man who stepped forward was named Jeffrey Dahmer, and his apartment was hiding something that would soon horrify the world. The Oxford apartments didn't look dangerous. Beige concrete, thin walls. The kind of place people moved into when they were starting over or running out of options. Neighbors came and went, shared elevators, nodded politely. Complaints were routine, noise, smells, arguments that burned hot and faded fast. No one imagined what was happening behind one particular door. Inside apartment 213, Dahmer lived alone. He worked at a chocolate factory. He paid his rent. He blended in. And for years, he committed murders in silence. The first real warning signs came not from police, but from the building itself. There were smells. At first, residents thought it was spoiled food. Then a plumbing issue. Then trash left too long in summer heat. Complaints were filed. Maintenance checked vents. Dahmer offered explanations. Meat gone bad, a freezer malfunction, chemicals from cleaning. People wanted to believe him. It was easier. A woman across the hall later said she remembered thinking, if something was really wrong, someone would do something. No one did. Milwaukee in the late 1980s and early 1990s was struggling with limited resources and rising crime. Calls stacked up. Cases blurred together. When young men, often marginalized, often without strong support systems, went missing, the urgency faded quickly. Dahmer understood that. He chose his victims carefully. He chose moments when attention was thin. He chose a city that wasn't looking too closely. Inside his apartment, he controlled everything. The door. The music. The narrative. Once inside, people vanished into paperwork gaps and unanswered questions. Neighbors later recalled hearing drilling at odd hours. The hum of machinery. Occasional crashes that sounded like furniture being moved. One woman reported seeing a large blue barrel delivered to the apartment. Another remembered the freezer, always running, always locked. Still, no one imagined murder. They imagined inconvenience. The night the escaped man reached police should have changed everything. Witnesses begged officers to look closer, to follow him inside, to ask harder questions. But the calm voice carried weight. The victim's confusion was mistaken for intoxication. And the officers left. The man was returned to the apartment. That decision would haunt the city forever. In the weeks that followed, more people disappeared. Names entered missing person databases and sank quietly to the bottom. Families waited for calls that never came. Flyers peeled off telephone poles. Then, finally, something broke the pattern. It wasn't a witness. It wasn't a confession. It was a handcuff. During a routine encounter months later, police stopped Dahmer for suspicious behavior. When they searched him, they found keys. One of them didn't match anything Dahmer could explain. An officer decided to follow instinct instead of procedure. They went back to apartment 213. Dahmer opened the door. The smell hit immediately. This time, there were no explanations that made sense. Officers stepped inside, unsure what they were looking for, only certain that something was wrong. The apartment was dim, cramped, unnaturally quiet. Music played softly from a speaker. The refrigerator hummed. They moved slowly, checking rooms, opening drawers. Ordinary objects felt wrong in that space. Out of place. Out of time. Then one officer opened the refrigerator. What he saw would end the search and begin the nightmare. Within hours, the building was sealed. Investigators flooded the apartment, moving through it with gloves and flashlights, documenting every detail. Each discovery raised more questions, not fewer. Evidence piled up in a way no one was prepared for. Dahmer was arrested without resistance. He didn't scream. He didn't fight. He spoke calmly, answering questions with a flat tone that unsettled everyone in the room. When asked how long it had been going on, he paused, not as if calculating guilt, but as if recalling dates on a calendar. Detectives realized they weren't dealing with a moment of violence. They were standing inside a system. As news broke, the city recoiled. Headlines spread across the country. Neighbors who had shared walls with Dahmer sat in shock, replaying memories that suddenly felt sinister. The smell, the sounds, the excuses. Families of the missing gathered around televisions, hoping, dreading, recognizing details that matched their worst fears. And then came the questions no one wanted to answer. How could this happen for so long? How could someone return a victim to that apartment? How many chances had been missed? Internal reviews began almost immediately. Officers were placed on leave. Reports were re-examined. Calls replayed. The night of the escape became a focal point, a moment when everything could have changed. But accountability moved slowly. Meanwhile, Dahmer began to talk. In interrogation rooms, he described his actions without drama. He didn't boast. He didn't plead. He spoke as if recounting a routine, explaining how he avoided detection, how he understood which complaints would be ignored, how he learned to sound believable. Psychologists observed carefully. Here was a man who didn't fit the screaming stereotype. He was quiet, withdrawn, methodical. A criminal mind that relied not on chaos, but on order. The more he spoke, the more horrifying the scope became. The Oxford apartments became a symbol, not just of Dahmer's crimes, but of everything that failed around them. Neighbors struggled with guilt. City officials faced outrage. Activists pointed to patterns of neglect that had allowed the case to fester. This wasn't just about one man. It was about systems that decided who mattered. As investigators prepared formal charges, they discovered something else: records of prior complaints, prior stops, prior opportunities. Moments that, taken alone, seemed small. Together, they formed a map of how evil survives in plain sight. Late one night, a detective returned to the apartment for a final sweep. Evidence had been removed. The space was nearly empty. The smell lingered faintly, embedded in walls that would soon be torn down. He stood in the kitchen, staring at the refrigerator door, now sealed with tape. Behind him, someone whispered, "How did nobody see this?" The detective didn't answer. Because the truth was worse. People had seen it. They just hadn't understood what they were looking at. And as the city tried to come to terms with what had been hiding in apartment 213, one realization cut deeper than all the rest. Jeffrey Dahmer hadn't been hiding in the shadows. He had been living right next door. And what investigators would uncover next would reveal just how close they'd come to stopping him, before it was far too late. The building emptied quickly after the arrest, as if fear itself had learned how to use the stairs. Residents stood on the sidewalk in clusters, wrapped in blankets, watching officers carry boxes out of apartment 213. No one spoke loudly. Every sound felt disrespectful, too close to the walls that had heard everything and said nothing. Some people cried. Others stared at the windows, trying to remember when they had first noticed the smell, and why they had accepted the answer they were given. Inside, the investigation moved with a grim precision. Detectives photographed every surface. They logged items that, on their own, meant nothing. Together, they told a story of routine. Not rage. Not panic. Routine. That realization unsettled even seasoned investigators. This wasn't a crime scene frozen after a single act. It was a workspace. Dahmer sat in an interrogation room under fluorescent lights that buzzed faintly overhead. He appeared smaller without the walls of his apartment around him, thinner, quieter. When asked basic questions, he answered without hesitation. Employment. He corrected an officer's pronunciation of his last name. He asked for water politely. When the questions turned to the apartment, his tone didn't change. He described his life in Milwaukee as if it had simply unfolded. loneliness, drinking. He spoke about how easy it was to invite someone inside when you knew what they wanted to hear. He talked about trust like it was a tool, something you picked up, used carefully, then put away. Detectives noticed something chilling. He didn't talk about fear. Not his own, and not his victims'. Fear wasn't part of the equation. Avoidance was. Strategy was. Timing was. As the hours passed, the scale of the case expanded beyond anything the department had prepared for. Evidence from the apartment connected to missing persons reports across years. Names that had once been separate files were suddenly linked by one address. The failures began surfacing almost immediately. Supervisors reviewed the night of the escape, replaying audio, reading reports, watching body camera footage that captured hesitation instead of urgency. The victim's injuries had been visible. Witnesses had been vocal. The decision to return him to the apartment now read like a confession written in ink no one could erase. Public outrage followed fast. City officials held press conferences that said little. Words like review, process, and protocol filled the air. For families, those words sounded hollow. They wanted to know why their loved ones hadn't been protected when protection was possible. Community leaders pointed to deeper problems, whose complaints were taken seriously, whose lives triggered action, whose disappearances were allowed to fade. The case wasn't just about Dahmer anymore. It was about a system that had learned how to look away. Inside the jail, Dahmer became a subject of study. Psychiatrists interviewed him in long sessions, probing for emotion, remorse, explanation. What they found was a man who understood consequences but not responsibility. He could describe actions clearly, but when asked why, he circled back to himself, his needs, his impulses, his isolation. He acknowledged that he knew what he was doing was wrong. He just didn't feel it. The media descended on Milwaukee with an appetite that felt unmanageable. Cameras crowded sidewalks. Headlines competed for shock value. Neighbors were interviewed again and again, each retelling sharpening details that had once seemed harmless. One woman remembered how Dahmer had held the door open for her. Another recalled a brief conversation about the weather. Small kindnesses, now poisoned by hindsight. As the trial approached, prosecutors faced a difficult choice. They could focus narrowly, presenting a clear, controlled case. Or they could reveal the full scope and risk overwhelming the jury with horror. They chose clarity, but even restraint couldn't soften the truth. In court, Dahmer pleaded guilty but insane. The plea shifted the tone immediately. The trial became less about whether he had committed the crimes, there was no dispute, and more about whether he understood them well enough to be held fully accountable. Expert witnesses testified for days. Some argued that his behavior showed planning, awareness, and control, signs of sanity. Others pointed to his internal detachment, his inability to form empathy, his fractured sense of connection. The courtroom listened as psychology and law collided, each trying to define where responsibility ended. Families sat through every session. They listened to clinical language describe lives they had loved. They watched Dahmer sit quietly, occasionally taking notes, rarely reacting. For some, his stillness was the hardest part. There was no visible regret to absorb their anger. No collapse that might suggest recognition of the harm done. Outside the courthouse, protests grew. People demanded answers from the police department. Officers involved in the escape incident were suspended, then reinstated. Internal investigations cited errors in judgment, not malice. That distinction did little to calm the public. Trust had been broken. As the verdict approached, tension settled over the city like heavy air before a storm. When the jury rejected the insanity defense, there was relief, but it was complicated. A conviction couldn't undo what had already happened. It could only mark an ending. Dahmer was sentenced to multiple life terms. In prison, he became both notorious and vulnerable. Inmates recognized his name. Guards monitored him closely. He received letters from strangers who tried to understand him, who tried to claim pieces of his story for themselves. He answered some. In interviews granted under strict conditions, Dahmer spoke about his past with a strange detachment. He acknowledged failures, his own and the system's. He talked about how close he'd come to being stopped earlier. How easily it could have ended differently. Those comments unsettled investigators more than outright denial ever could. Because they were true. Files reviewed after the trial revealed just how many times Dahmer had brushed against exposure. A noise complaint dismissed. A traffic stop ended with a warning. A report that went nowhere. Each moment small enough to ignore, powerful enough to matter. Milwaukee tried to move forward. The Oxford apartments were eventually demolished. The lot sat empty for years, grass growing over concrete, as if time itself wanted to erase the shape of the building. But memory doesn't follow zoning laws. For the families, for the city, the outline remained. Training programs were updated. Policies rewritten. Officers attended seminars on bias, on crisis response, on listening when something felt wrong. Change came, but slowly, carried on the weight of consequences. And yet, even as reforms took shape, another truth lingered. Dahmer had not relied on brilliance or speed. He hadn't outsmarted everyone. He had simply counted on what most people count on, that someone else would handle it, that the explanation offered was good enough, that discomfort didn't require action. In his final interviews, Dahmer said something that never made it into the headlines. He described his crimes not as moments of impulse, but as outcomes of permission created by silence, by disbelief, by systems that preferred order over disruption. It wasn't an excuse. It was an observation. As the years passed, the case became shorthand for failure and horror. But for those who studied it closely, it was also a warning. Not about monsters hiding in shadows, but about danger that lives in plain sight, protected by routine and hesitation. And as investigators closed the last files connected to apartment 213, one question remained unanswered. If the signs had been recognized sooner, if the door had been opened that night, how many lives would still be alive to tell their own stories? The answer sat in the silence between reports. And it echoed. The day Jeffrey Dahmer was sentenced, Milwaukee exhaled, but the breath caught in its throat. Life sentences stacked one after another sounded decisive on paper. In reality, they felt symbolic, like a line drawn too late. The courtroom emptied slowly, families lingering as if the air itself might offer something more than a verdict. Dahmer was led away without ceremony, his expression unchanged, his hands folded as if he were leaving a meeting early. Outside, cameras waited for reactions that didn't come. There was nothing left to say. In the weeks that followed, the city tried to understand how a nightmare had taken root in such ordinary soil. Committees were formed. Policies were reviewed. Officers attended training sessions where Dahmer's name was spoken with clinical distance. But understanding a failure doesn't erase it. It only teaches you where the cracks were. Behind prison walls, Dahmer adjusted quickly. He followed rules. He kept his head down. Guards noted his predictability, his preference for routine. In a place built on structure, he blended in again. That unsettled the people assigned to watch him. Psychologists continued their evaluations, searching for insight that might justify the years of unanswered questions. Dahmer spoke about control, about isolation, about the quiet moments when he felt most invisible. He acknowledged that his crimes had escalated not because he wanted more attention, but because he had learned how little resistance existed. That admission rippled through law enforcement circles. It reframed the case not as a story of inevitability, but of opportunity, missed again and again. Cold case units reopened files across the Midwest. Some cases were confirmed as Dahmer's. Others were ruled out, bringing relief and grief in equal measure. A few lingered in limbo, their connections plausible but unprovable. For those families, closure became a word that lost its meaning. In Milwaukee, the site where the Oxford apartments once stood became a quiet scar. No memorial, no marker. Just grass and wind and a sense that something refused to settle. Residents avoided the lot, unconsciously rerouting their walks. Parents shortened explanations when children asked why no one built there. Memory didn't need bricks. Years later, when Dahmer agreed to speak with investigators again, the request was met with caution. He had little left to trade, and they knew it. Still, they listened. Not because they expected confession, but because understanding patterns mattered more than details. He spoke about the night the escaped man was returned to him. Not with anger. Not with triumph. With surprise. "I didn't think they would," he said. "But they did." That sentence circulated quietly among officers and administrators. It became a lesson etched into training manuals and whispered in briefings. A reminder that authority doesn't just act, it signals. And sometimes, that signal tells the wrong people they're untouchable. In 1994, the story ended abruptly. Dahmer was killed inside the prison by another inmate during a work detail. The news spread fast, igniting debates that flared and burned out within days. Some called it justice. Others called it failure. Most felt nothing at all, just a dull sense that the final chapter had closed without answers. The case files were sealed. But the consequences were not. In the years that followed, Milwaukee changed. Slowly. Unevenly. The police department revised its procedures for missing persons. Community outreach expanded. Bias training became mandatory. None of it could undo the past, but it shifted the future in subtle ways. Nationally, the case entered textbooks, documentaries, classrooms. Dahmer's name became shorthand for a specific kind of horror, not the chaotic kind, but the quiet kind. The kind that thrives on politeness and assumption. The kind that survives because it looks familiar. For survivors who had crossed his path and lived, time brought complicated peace. They spoke at events, gave interviews, tried to articulate instincts they hadn't trusted at the time. Many said the same thing, that the danger wasn't obvious, that it felt wrong only in retrospect. Subscribe now, hit like, and leave a comment, because once this door opens, there's no closing it again.